If you ever thought, I don't know why I feel this way, I have no reason to feel this way, if those have been things that have come to your mind, this video is for you. Because dismissing your feelings is a trauma response that is costing you peace. Let's talk about why you do this, what happens to your body and your energy field when you are doing this, and how you can start honoring your feelings without fear. Hi, my name is Tony. I'm the trauma doula, a somatic guide, and energy healer. So first off, let's talk about where this pattern comes from and some of the ways that it may have snuck into your reality. So first, let's talk about where these patterns come from specifically and see if you recognize any of these things within yourself. So oftentimes, the very first thing we think of like, where is this coming from, or why do I do this, is specifically from childhood. We're always talking about childhood trauma here, and that is a really good place to start when you are thinking of any trauma response that you have right now. Even if it seems like it doesn't make sense, because oftentimes the things that can cause the most harm internally are things that aren't necessarily always big T trauma. When we think about trauma in general, we often think about things that are catastrophic, but oftentimes it's the little T traumas. It's the things that happen or don't happen that begin to erode away at our sense of self and our sense of worth and our sense of counting. So one of the places that this pattern comes from is invalidation and suppression of emotions in your childhood. This could be because your family system. So family system is anyone who was within your system of care as you were unable to care for yourself in the world. Oftentimes in childhood, or if you're really, really sick, oftentimes your family system and system of care are people who we're talking about when we talk about family system. Anyway, so when your family system didn't allow for you to feel feelings, there was no room for your feelings. There was only room for the feelings of other people to be important in the space, in the home, even in the school at times. Sometimes at school, the teacher's feelings were more important than the student's feelings because the teacher didn't want to go outside or something. So they're like, we're not going outside today. But oftentimes, the way you see this is when you're in child rearing, when there's no room for your grief, you might hear stop crying, or I'll give you something to cry about. There may be rage that's not, even if it's rightful. Sometimes even your joy was too much in childhood. You might have heard, go sit down, stop playing. It's kind of weird to tell a child to stop playing because the work of childhood is play. That's how you learned. That is the only thing a child really needs to do, is to learn and play and grow. So if there's no room for you to feel fear or sadness as a young person, then the fullest expression of your being can't really come forth, because we're here to experience all of our feelings. We don't have to react to all of our feelings, but we are here to experience them as they are, the colors of the quilt of the life that we're making. And so if there was no room for your expression of feeling and emotion, if that was too intense or too much, whether it's, some kids cried because they felt so much. I was one of those kids. I would cry about a dog. I would cry about going to school. I would cry about staying home from school. I would cry because there was a feeling of sadness in the air. And if you're emotionally sensitive, or just highly sensitive in general, you probably had heightened emotions, and they were even more likely to be suppressed and contained to boxes that other people felt like they could deal with. That's oftentimes the way that we think about rearing children at this point in time in our evolution as people, for some reason, is to contain and mold into containers that we are able to take in, right? It has a lot to do with capitalism, but I won't go into that today. But anyhow, one of the places that this pattern of this feeling of like, I don't know why I feel like this, and oftentimes the person that's saying, I don't know why I feel like this, goes on to tell you the most horrific story you've ever heard, about the most horrific people you've ever heard of. And you're like, you don't know why you feel like XYZ. And so this pattern of dismissing all that is you, is coming from you, is a pattern of not being held as you were growing up. Because as children, you're probably the most unfiltered you'll ever be, unless you come to a place where you start to unmask and undress, so to speak, your true nature. The other ways that these patterns kind of creep in are ancestral or cultural places. So when we talk about being cycle breakers, when we talk about breaking generational chains of trauma that have been passed down from generation to generation, when we're talking about breaking the cycles of a lineage, sometimes we're talking about the way in which we've dismissed ourselves before we even get to be in the room. And one of the most common ways that we are teaching people how to be with and experience emotions, or the ways that we suppress, is seen as in the way that we express the gender binary system. You know, the way we raise children, and we say, so the way that it shows up most clearly is in the gender binary. And the way that we raise children, girls do this, boys do that, boys don't cry, girls cry, boys should lead, girls should be quiet, right? All of these ways are ways of shifting and changing and molding a person to suppress who they are. Boy or girl, boys can cry. That is a normal, natural response to feeling whatever feeling, right? And the most clear example I have of the way that this really affects children and adults even now is when I used to work in the crisis center. I was, working with the kids and whatever. And there was this one particular girl that was putting on a Spider-Man costume. And this one little boy was so angry at her that he started to rip the costume off of her body. And I said, what are you doing? Stop that, right? And he said, she's a girl, she can't be Spider-Man. And I said, it doesn't matter, she could be anything she wants to be. She could be the dang postman, I don't care. I don't know what I said, but you could see and feel the ways in which he had been suppressed to stay in a binary, and also to tap and say, no, if I do this, you can't do that. Children learn by example. So at some point, that little boy was probably pretty severely reprimanded for potentially putting on a dress and being a princess. They were like 10. Right? Who cares? But somebody does, because the fullest expression of our humanness, our beingness, our feeling is currently being suppressed in this society, because if we felt what we felt, we would be following our truth and not the truth that people tried to place on us. So it's really important to understand that this is a trauma response that is passed down through lineage of the ways of being, the ways that you're supposed to be, and the way that your mother was supposed to be, the way your mother's mother was supposed to be, the way your mother's mother was supposed to be. And now it gets to you and you say, is this really what I'm supposed to be? So these are the ways that we start to break the ancestral chains of limitations that were passed down to us, but it takes time. And recognize oftentimes that it's not your fault that you're dismissing your feelings and you feel like you don't count. These are just the ways that you were taught. These were just inherited culturally, ancestrally, and in childhood. And then that coping strategy to deal with being dismissed or suppressed becomes an identity. And identity formation is really, really important. And it's one of the things that can keep us stuck in place if you identify with the trauma of feeling sad is unacceptable. And if you feel sad, you should look around at the world because look at these other people and you could have it worse. And that leads me to my next point, which is how it shows up in the world. That it could be worse. Other people have it worse. Look around. Look around. Other people have it worse than you. So why should you feel, insert anything you want there? Because no matter how you feel, when you are taught this way, it will be invalid. And no matter why you feel that way, if you were taught that way, it will be invalid. Even if it's the most horrific thing, somehow it's invalid when compared to some other thing that is somehow worse, right? But why are we here comparing when we should just be living and experiencing what we are right now? The other part of that is like, it's not that bad. It could be worse. It's not that bad. And then you start to put a feeling state, a mood on top of all the things underneath so that you're never really able to identify how you actually feel. So a lot of that comes off in brain fog. It comes off in, I'm tired, but really you're sad, you're depressed, you're angry on top of anger. And then underneath that anger, there's more sadness about the invalidation of self that's coming forth at this moment. So recognize where this comes from and how this shows up. If you've heard that it could be worse, somebody's always got it worse than you, you may have been having your feelings completely invalidated. So then you never learn to listen to yourself. So then you don't know what you feel ever. And this also leads to a lot of the reasons why people are in really abusive relationships. Because in a sense, that invalidation makes them think that that's what they deserve. Because someone always has it worse, right? What's something you feel like doesn't count? What feeling do you think doesn't matter? Even though your body keeps bringing it up, you can comment it below, or you can like the video and just let people know that you're feeling it. So how can we begin to shift these patterns of invalidating self? Because again, why do you not want to invalidate yourself? Because if you're invalidating yourself, you leave an energetic opening for someone to come in and say, yes, I'll come in and invalidate everything that you are, and I will make sure to gaslight you to eternity. Because you've invalidated yourself, you've taken the place of your abuser, and now you gaslight yourself. And so now that feels normal, and now that feels familiar, right? Familiar isn't always good. Sometimes it's just an old pattern repeating itself over and over again, right? And then it feels familiar, and then you end up in these toxic, abusive relationships. That is a really big problem, I think, for trauma survivors in general, childhood trauma survivors and cycle breakers, is they end up in these like toxic relationships and friendships, that's a number one sign. Okay. Anyway, moving on. How can you begin to shift from a state of invalidation? I don't know why I feel this way. I don't know. It's just like a term for it doesn't matter, right? I don't know doesn't mean that you don't actually literally know. It means it doesn't matter. That's the underlying subconscious belief behind I don't know. So again, getting back to the point, how you can begin to shift these patterns is starting by validating your emotions. Even if you don't know what they are, it doesn't matter if you don't know what they are right now. Maybe you don't know that you feel sad. You just know you feel a way and you don't know why you feel that way. Pause and say, I feel this. You may not know what the feeling is because you've been suppressing it, but you know it's there. So just say, I feel it. And then you might take a step back and do something else, because sometimes that's really intense. Just saying like, I feel this thing here. The other thing you can do is ground in the sensation. However, I will put a caveat of like, if you are diving into sensation, that can be, I feel like that's a little bit advanced work, especially if you have no other tools for sensation movement type somatic work. And that's where I'll shameless plug. My consultations links are in the first comment below. So if that is something you want support with, go ahead and look there. But you can ground into the sensation. You can notice it and notice the ways that the sensation's being. Is it hot? Is it cold? Is it left or is it right? Is it up or is it down? You know, those kind of noticings. And again, if that gets too intense, you can kind of switch out of that and go do something that is normal and average in your routine, okay? Additionally, you can say, maybe it does make sense that I feel this way. And I put the word maybe there very intentionally, because you can't go from, I don't know why I feel this way, to like, I know exactly why I feel this way, and I know, step it into that. That can be a little bit extreme. So maybe, ooh, that's an opening. That's a little bit of space. That's a place where I can breathe a little bit. Maybe I do know. And then pause with that. Chill with that. And then lastly is just like somatic attunement, which again is the grounding in the sensation. So attuning to yourself in a somatic way is checking in with the sensations and recognizing them without trying to control them with your mind, okay? This isn't mind control. You're not gonna top down yourself. That's why we're trying to bottom up yourself, okay? If that makes sense. So some of the things to keep in mind is you don't need to justify why you feel what you feel. You don't need to justify it. You just feel it. That's it. It's that simple. And if it's not, maybe it can be. Maybe it can be a little bit later. Anyhow, your body knows the truth. If you like this video, share this video with 2 of your friends, and drop a comment below. Thanks.